Hello students, I'm Mrs. Ihejimagha. I'm here to teach you Agric Science. And our topic this day is pasture and forage crops. Okay. Before we start, we will first of all know what is pasture. And then by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to know what is pasture and what we mean by forage crops. You have been coming across this word, forage crops always, right from JS1. What do we mean by forage crops? And what is pasture? Pasture is a vast piece of land where forage crops are grown. Forage crops are grown in the pasture. And then what is forage crops? Forage crops are those crops used in feeding livestock. Crops used in feeding livestock, and they are mainly grasses and legumes. But a farmer may decide to plant arable crops like maize, beans, groundnuts in the pasture. And then those crops are not for the farmer to consume, but they are for feeding animals. So in that case, those crops are forage crops. So we look at the meaning of pasture. Large piece of land where forage crops are grown. And then forage crops are crops used for feeding livestock. Okay. And they are mainly grasses and legumes. So in a pasture, we have two main types of pasture. Two main types of pasture. One is natural pasture. Types of pasture. Types of pasture. Natural pasture. And established pasture. Okay. What do we mean by natural pasture? Natural pasture simply means a piece of land where grasses and legumes grew on their own. Nobody planted them. The typical example is the savanna grassland in Nigeria. Most of you are geography students. When you look at the geography of Nigeria, we have the forest zone and then we have the savanna in the north, the forest zone in the south and the savanna in the north. Then we have different types of savanna, but generally the savanna grassland. Grassland. Okay. Then the established pasture are those grasses and legumes grown in a pasture that the farmer planted. The farmer selected the species, very good species of grasses and legumes and planted, established, and then the farmer takes care, good care of them, looks after them, and so on. So we call them established pasture or sown pasture. Okay. So in a pasture, we have qualities or characteristics of a good pasture, whether it is established or whether it is natural. One, characteristics. Of good pasture. One, the grasses and legumes growing there must be resistant to fire outbreak. When there's outbreak of fire, like during this dry season, forests are set ablaze by children who look for animals, rats. Like during Christmas, you play your knockout, the forest is set ablaze, and then the children will run away. So those grasses and legumes grown there will not be destroyed. The species, the type of grasses growing there will not be destroyed by fire. So the grasses and legumes in a good pasture must be resistant to fire outbreak. Again, another characteristics, the grasses and legumes, the plants growing in a good pasture must be resistant to trampling. Resistant to trampling. To trampling. What do we mean by that? No, these animals that graze, that feed, that the herdsmen take along to feed, they are looking for water, they are looking for food. When they are walking in the forest, when they are moving about, they use their hooves to march on those grasses and legumes. And then if the grasses and legumes that are growing there, if they are not resistant, once the animals march them with the hooves, those plants will die. But such good species of plants, legumes, grasses growing there, after marching on them, within a short time, maybe in the evening with this dew, they will rise up again. They will still survive. They won't die. That's what we mean by resistant to trampling. So a good pasture must contain grasses and legumes that are resistant to trampling. Another good characteristics of a good pasture. A good pasture must contain grasses and legumes that are aggressive. They must be aggressive. What do you mean by aggressive? Not that they will be looking for trouble, fighting, and then eating others. No. They will be aggressive means they will not allow other crops to overshadow, grow, and then make them to suppressing them. You know, plants need sunlight for their photosynthesis. Sunlight is very, very important. When plants are planted or you plant them in a place where they won't get enough sunlight, it affects the plants because they won't get enough sunlight, and then photosynthesis is a very big problem. So such grasses and legumes must be aggressive, not allowing other crops, not allowing the grasses will not allow the legumes will not allow the grasses. And of course, you know, weeds also grow there. So they won't allow them to suppress them. they'll be struggling to survive. So they'll be very aggressive. Then another characteristics is that those grasses and legumes there that are growing there will also make room to accommodate each other. The grasses will not suppress the legumes. The legumes will not suppress the grasses. They will be growing comfortably, trying to accommodate each other so that they will all survive. Okay. Then another, the grasses and legumes, we are talking about characteristics of good pasture. Those plants growing there must be such that immediately the seeds touch the ground, they'll be able to germinate. They will grow without wasting time, without giving the farmer much problem. Okay. Then another, the grasses there must be the type that when the animals consume them or when the farmer harvests them, they will be able to grow back within a very short time, so that the farmer will not be in a problem of looking for where to harvest grasses and legumes to feed his animals. So these are some of the characteristics of a good pasture. Then we have mentioned the characteristics of good pasture, and I've told you that we have two major types of pasture: the rainforest zone in the south, and then the savanna in the north. And then in the rainforest, most of these grasses and legumes grow on their own because there's a lot of rainfall. Rain is always falling, and those grasses and legumes grow on their own without much problem to the farmer. Unlike in the savanna, where you have very few months of rainfall, and then the farmer will plant, will take care, will water, will feed, and so on, taking good care of these grasses and legumes to make sure that the animals are fed, because that's the source of income to the farmer. So making sure that the animals are well fed so that they can produce well and reproduce to make the farmer to earn income. Okay. Then we go to the management practices in a pasture. Management practices in a pasture. Okay. Okay. Remember we said we have types: natural and then the sown pasture. So these management practices are mainly for sown pasture, because in this sown pasture, the farmer may decide to buy a very large piece of land, and then what he will decide is to plant crops, the forage crops that he will use in feeding his livestock, because that is where he gets his money. So he is going to the money, the farmer will spend so much money, spend time, employ laborers and so on to make sure that animals have something to eat always. So one of the management practices in a pasture, remember very well, in agriculture, we don't encourage bush burning. Bush burning is never encouraged in agriculture. But you can see that in pasture, that's the aspect that we encourage bush burning. Bush burning. So in pasture, we do what we call burning. Okay. In burning, you don't just set the forest or the bush ablaze and then leave them for fire to be burning, destroying. No. you born in a pasture, you born at least once a year. And when do you born? At the end of dry season. What did I say? At the end of dry season. Because immediately after the dry season, within a short time, the rains will start. That is where you born the pasture. Why is burning important in a pasture? Remember, during grazing, we call it grazing, feeding animals, when animals feed themselves. Unlike when you go and cut and bring to the animals to feed. That is part of feeding. Then at times, you allow the animals, or you take the animals to the pasture. Then the animals do the feeding themselves. So during feeding, the animals move about, the farm animals move about. And in the process of moving about, there are some ectoparasites on the body of the animals. Ectoparasites. So when these animals are moving about, these ectoparasites, remember ecto and endo. Endo are parasites that are within the body of the animals. They are in the body. You won't see them. They are there, constituting danger to the body of the animals. But the ecto are outside. You see them. Typical example, the ticks, the fluke, and fleas, and so on and so forth. So they are on the body of the animal, biting the animals, sucking their blood, and so on. So when the animals are moving around, these ectoparasites fall off from the body of the animals and stay on the ground. On the ground, some of them will lay their eggs will hatch and continue to multiply. They reproduce, and then waiting for other animals. Another animal may come, they will climb on the top of the animal, continue, and the process will continue. But when you born at the end of the dry season, very, very important, the period of burning in pasture, end of dry season, onset of rainy season. Because when you born, within a short time, the rain will fall. And those grasses, the storms, the roots, they will resurrect. They will rise up. You don't born at the peak of dry season. If you do that, the grasses will die. So you born. When you born, the fire, the heat of the fire will destroy those ectoparasites on the pasture. And then the pasture will be free of ectoparasites. Any set of livestock coming will be free to feed freely and go without the ectoparasites affecting them. So again, in burning, when you burn also, it helps the new stalk, new leaves to grow, new grasses to grow, because those grasses have very strong root stalks. So when you burn, the fire will destroy what is outside, but new ones will come out and start growing. Then the animals will have what to eat always. That is why burning is very important in a pasture. Then the second management aspect is what we call fencing. Fencing. Fencing is very, very important. What do we mean by fencing? It doesn't mean that you use very expensive wall or whatever. No. Simply means dividing the land into portions. You divide the land into portions. And that takes us to what we call paddocking. Paddocking in pasture. Paddocking. Yes. Dividing the land, the pasture, into paddocks. And these paddocks will now enable the farmer to take the animals from one section to another section. Maybe the whole of this month, the animal will be feeding on this portion. The whole of this month, the animals will be feeding, the farm animals will be feeding on this portion. Then next month, they will leave this portion and come to the second portion. And while they are here, this one is trying to regain. There will be no feeding, no grazing on it. After this, they move to the next. After that, they move to the next. So you see, by the time they move gradually, then the first ones will now regain and grow back for the animals to use them. Again, when you fence or do what we call paddocking, it will prevent stray animals from anywhere coming in to make use of what the farmer has spent money and time to establish. So you fence it, and then you want the animals to be on a particular section of where you want them to be. Because if it's not fenced, immediately you take them in, the animals will scatter. The animals, they are not human beings. They will scatter to all sections of the pasture and be feeding. But you want them to be on a particular portion. That is the essence of paddocking and fencing in a pasture. So they'll be moving from one particular area to the other, from one particular. It helps the animals, the farmer also to control the animals, also help not allowing stray animals, stray human beings to move into the pasture. Okay. Then another management pasture, another management practice in a pasture is what we call mowing. Mowing. What do we mean by mowing in a pasture? Mowing is when you harvest. Remember, we said there are two types of feeding. Going to cut, bringing to the animals. When the animals are in the pen, you don't allow them to come out. There's a time that type of management is good. There's a time also they need to move out. So when they are in their pen, then the farmer will go out and cut and then bring to them. And then when you cut and bring to them, like we said in paddocking, from one stage to another, from one stage to another, from one portion to another. Yes, you don't go to a particular portion always. Continue cutting from one portion. No, you rotate. And as you are rotating, the first area you have harvested from will be regaining, growing back. So when you mow, then you bring to the farm animals in their pens and the animals will feed. Or you take the animals to the pasture, the animals will also feed in the pasture. So when you are mowing, you give space. After cutting, you leave for about 3 to 4 weeks before you go back. You don't go there always, every day. You continue cutting and cutting. No, that's the essence of the management. Then the other one, the another management practices that is very important in the pasture is stocking rate. Stocking rate is very. What do we mean by stocking rate in the management of pasture? Remember, we said there are two types of feeding. Going to cut, bringing to the animals in their pen, or allowing the animals to go out for grazing. So when you allow them to go out for grazing in the pasture, the number of animals you send to a particular portion at any time is very, very important. You don't send too many animals on a particular portion. When you send too many animals, then it means you are overstocking. You are overstocking. It is very dangerous in pasture, overstocking. When you overstock, then you are exposing the land to erosion. So you don't overstock. If the area is big, you send large number. If the area is small, you send small number. And again, when you are sending animals for grazing, you mix the farm animals, the big and the small. You don't send only the big ones. You don't send only the small ones. Remember, the grasses grow tall, the legumes grow small. They don't grow too high. So the big animals will be eating those grasses, like the elephant grasses that are tall. The cattle, they'll be feeding on them. Then the goats, the sheep that are small, will be feeding on the small ones. So you don't send only big ones and they eat all the tall ones. Then those small grasses and legumes will be left over. No. So you mix the species of the animals you send, both the big and the small. You don't send only the big ones. You don't also send only the small ones, because the grasses and legumes, they have different heights. This is very, very important on the stocking. And you don't send too many. Very, very important to avoid overgrazing and then exposing the land to erosion. Okay. Then another management aspect we will look into is, again, we have said about stocking rate. Then the next one is okay, we have mentioned fencing, stocking rate, and then harvesting. Okay, like I said, in harvesting, you mind the portion. You harvest the first portion. Next time you move to the second portion. Then you move to the third portion, and so on, stage by stage in harvesting. Then we talk about, okay, yes, another important aspect is when in established pasture, when the farmer is establishing the grasses and the legumes, you make sure that the percentage of grasses will be 60%. The percentage of legumes will be 30%. And then, of course, anywhere that plants are planted, weeds must grow. So maybe weeds 10%. 10%. So this is a very nice composition. If the farmer doesn't take care of these things, you may discover that in the portion of pasture, you may have about 80% of grasses, and then you have about 15% of weeds, and then the legumes there may be 5%, which is not a good combination. So the right proportion will be 60, 30, of course, 10 weeds, or even less, better, in a good pasture. That's the management, the aspect the farmer will take care of. Okay. Then in a pasture, in a good pasture also, another management practices on a good pasture will be weed control, of course. Weed control. Remember, established pasture, the farmer has taken time to select the species of grasses, the species of legumes. The farmer will look for the best species of legumes and plant, not just any grass, not just any legume and plant. So the farmer will as well control weeds, because if you don't control weeds, then the weeds will outgrow and overshadow the grasses and the legumes, and the legumes will not do well. And then when they grow, there'll be mainly weeds, and some of these weeds are very poisonous to the plants, to the animals when they consume them. Even when they touch the body of the animals, they become poisonous. So the farmer will make sure that he weeds the farm, control the weeds and the grasses growing there. Then another management aspect is, remember, in a pasture, that is where you provide food for the animals. Like now or before now, there was no rain. No rain, everywhere is dry. And the animals have to eat. So how do you provide their food? You don't cook beans and rice and give to the animal. So how do you provide? Then the farmer will do what we call irrigation. Irrigation. When the weather is so dry that the grasses and legumes are no longer growing, the farmer will now irrigate. Make sure he waters the pasture for the grasses and legumes to grow, so that the animals will have what to eat. Irrigation, very, very important in the pasture. Okay, he has to irrigate. Then fertilizer application. Yes, it's very funny. Very funny to say that you apply fertilizer where grasses and legumes grow. Yes. If you can remember, one of the practices in crop production, fertilizer application is very, very important. Some of these grasses and legumes, the forage crops, they respond very well to nitrogenous fertilizers, especially the NPK. They respond when you apply them and then you irrigate, you water. You see them growing very well, very succulent. So that when the farmer goes for harvesting, the farmer will harvest enough. Or when the farmer sends the animals in for grazing, the animals will graze well, feed well. And then, where you cannot afford, yes, some of the farmers cannot afford fertilizers, they use animal dung, the humus in brackets, or animal dung. Okay, so they use them to apply if they can't buy fertilizers, like I said, the NPK. And the fertilizer you buy is nitrogenous fertilizer, not superphosphate. So these grasses, these forage crops respond to them very well. Because in a forage crops, what do you need? You need the leaves, the herbage, the leaves. That's what the animals need. So when you apply NPK, nitrogenous fertilizer, the leaves grow, out very well, very broad, and then the animals eat them and then do well. Because once the animals feed well, they will also produce well. Especially those of them that produce milk. They supply us with milk. Those, for their flesh, the meat, when we eat them. But if you don't feed them well, if they don't have enough nutrients, they will not produce well. So it's very, very important in the pasture. Okay. So with this, at least we've known the meaning of pasture. What pasture means? A piece of land where forage crops are grown. And what do we mean by forage crops? Those crops that we use mainly for feeding our livestock. Like I told you, a farmer may decide to plant maize. The farmer may decide to plant beans, cowpea. The farmer may decide to plant groundnut. Not for the farmer's use, but the farmer will plant them. When they are about to produce fruits, before they flower, the farmer will harvest them and then store for feeding livestock. They are all forage crops. Then in a pasture, mainly we have grasses and legumes. And there are different types of grasses and legumes. Types of grasses and legumes. Types of grasses. Let's talk about grasses first. 1. The Guinea grass. Guinea grass. I don't want to bother you so much with the botanical names before you start shouting. The Guinea grass. We have the elephant grass. Then we have the carpet grass. Okay, these are the common grasses. Then we go to legumes. Common legumes. Yes, I know if I say legumes now, you mention groundnut, beans. Yes, they are legumes. They are the ones we plant for our human consumption. But there are some legumes mainly for the animals. 1, the stylosanthus, the centrosema, the mucuna, Then we have the bambara. The bambara species. So these are the common grasses and legumes. There are others, many, that you must find in the pasture. So these grasses and legumes are you must always find them in the pasture. Like the Guinea grass. Guinea grass is all over. You see it mainly in the rainforest zone. The elephant grass also grow very tall. When you see the stem, it looks like the sugar cane, a cane. Then the carpet grass. Then we have the stylosanthus, the centrosema, the mucuna, the bambara, and so many, and too many of them. I don't want to bother you with the botanical names. So, for our lesson, you would tell me in your assignment what we mean by pasture, what do we mean by forage crops, and then the management practices. Very, very important, because WAEC will always ask. They may ask you to mention 5 management practices in a pasture, and they explain 2 or 3 of these management practices, so you know what they are and why are they important in the pasture. That's the most important thing. Like we said, burning in agriculture, we don't encourage bush burning, but in pasture we encourage burning. Why is burning encouraged in bush burning, in pasture? Why is it not encouraged? Because we know that fire destroys the living organisms in the soil. Fire destroys the plants. Fire destroys so many things. But in pasture, we encourage it. Why? So you say why? Fencing, partitioning of the land. And then remember what we said when you are fencing, paddocking. Very, very important. Paddocking. And very important. Mowing. You can mow. The local farmer can mow. Just use his cutlass or sickle to cut and bring to the animals. Then the stocking rate. The number of animals you send to a particular portion at a particular time. And remember, when you are sending, don't send a particular species of animal. Mix up the species. And you know why. The big one and the small one. We said why it's always good to mix. Then weed control. Then irrigation during the dry season. Fertilizer application. especially nitrogenous fertilizer. Then where the farmer cannot afford the fertilizer, he use animal dung or humus. Of course, typical example of grasses and legumes. Okay, so for your assignment, you explain pasture and forage crops, and then the management practices. Out of the ones you list, you explain three, and then give us typical example of grasses and legumes. I said I don't want to bother you with the botanical names before you start shouting now, because if I underline, remember the botanical names, where you write, you underline the first whole letter with capital letter, and then the first word starts with capital, and then the second word starts with small letter, and it must be underlined, unless you are writing in italics. I don't want to bother you to that. Okay, good morning, class.